recognize this lady? Okay, so can you raise your hands and tell me? Yes, someone? I thought I heard the right answer. Yes. It's impossible to hear from there. You'll have to be loud. Wrote the code for Apollo 11. If you'd been present in this lecture hall, you would have seen that the previous tab was Apollo 11. So it has to do something with it, right? But who is this person? Margaret what? Margaret Hamilton. Right? So it's a very nice story. So she's what do you think she's standing with? She's posing with? Is this the Yellow Pages? Has anyone seen the Yellow Pages? Or all of you are born much after the existence of Yellow Pages? Anyone heard of Yellow Pages directories? So these were the huge, thick directories which you would have. Which would have the phone number and contact for everyone in the city, in the country, right? You would have a Yellow Pages for different cities. But she's not holding Yellow Pages. She's holding something else. She's holding the code which ran the Apollo 11 mission. So let's watch a really short video about her story and see if we can find something insightful from that. Okay, so I never anticipated this problem. This is something which often turns up when you give some live demos. So I need to be muted here in order to be able to transmit, in order to ensure that there is no output problem. Can someone from the classroom team call the classroom? Call the classroom support person. The classroom support person was just nearby only, the one who's setting up the Zoom. So it would be good to hear the story in her own words. We'll try to see if we can get that working in a minute or two. Otherwise, I just say what she was saying here. इससे आउटपुट साउंड आउटपुट देना है, वहां पे एको आएगा. That almost sounds like a horror movie, so we have to fix that. कैसे प्ले होगा? इसमें अलग से खोलना पड़ेगा. Okay, so in the interest of time, we are not going to do the experiment. We'll do that sometime later. But this just shows you that software can fail at runtime, right? So I never anticipated this problem. But fortunately, this story is very inspiring. And so this story is about Margaret Hamilton. She was the first women engineer who was hired by NASA. Right? And so before that, they didn't even have these terms like software engineering or engineers or rocket scientists. So they didn't have all of these terms around this time. So she was hired to write the code. She was hired to write the code for this mission, but she had a really small daughter. She was maybe a few years old. So she got a daughter to the simulator, to the missions, to the place, to the office where she was writing code. And maybe even without playing, I can just seek to that place. So this is her daughter. And this is a simulator in which, this was a simulator for the controller which was supposed to go to the moon, which was to send a human being to the moon. So Margaret Hamilton was worried. She thought that what if this happens when the control panel is actually on moon or it's in flight? And most of the NASA folks said that that is not going to happen because the NASA astronauts, they are not like kids. They are all trained cosmonauts, astronauts, right? They're not going to make such. So it was a pre-launch program which her daughter accidentally turned on the switch, right? So that is not what. So the NASA engineers thought that this is not going to happen in the actual flight because the astronauts are trained. But she insisted that she should have a fail-safe, and she ended up writing some additional code for a fail-safe. What if when the flight is on and someone accidentally presses on or off a button? So interestingly, when they were about to land, there was about 3-4 minutes before they were about to touch down on the lunar surface. One of the astronauts accidentally did put on the switch, which was a pre-launch program. Now, at that point of time, the command module just started beeping errors that this is a warning, you will crash, something like that. But fortunately, she had written the code which could then be a fail-safe, which ensured that such conditions were handled, right? And because of this, they were able to land. Then we had the famous iconic speech. They were able to come back safely. So there are a lot of very inspiring moments in this, how just bringing a small kid helped land man on the surface of the moon, right? But she was the first person who coined the term software engineering. So time to time, I'll try and bring up such stories. Unfortunately, we couldn't play the video. It would have been better in her own words in comparison to me telling the story. But a lot of lessons from this. It's a very inspiring story. So we've in fact named one of our servers behind her name. Like we call one of our computing servers as Hamilton server. So let's now come on to what I plan to discuss in this section. Before that, any other questions? So by the way, if any of you are curious and you think you've done a lot of programming, you should maybe see this GitHub repository called Apollo 11, which contains the source code, the exact source code which was used to land human beings on the moon. Right? So this is publicly available. So you may also find very interesting that the amount of compute that they had on the lunar modules at that point of time was probably lesser than what your smartwatch has today, right? But I just read this joke on the internet, like people were able to send people on the moon with such low compute power, but the tragedy or I don't know whether we should call this the business of the tragedy is that with so much compute power, most of the human population these days is busy watching cat and dog videos. We have much more compute power than what was there in the lunar module. Okay, so then let's begin the course. Couple of quick announcements. So if you go to the class website, some of you had asked that if we can mention the course syllabus or the list of topics which we plan to discuss. This is more or less a tentative list, but more or less the fixed list, but there could be some additions or deletions based on how we go in the course. And we have also put the lecture for tomorrow, which is just a set of slides. So there's a caveat with recording the video. It will take a bit of time, right? So as I was saying yesterday, please don't take the video as an excuse to not attend the class, right? So we'll often have tidbits with even the experienced programmers. I would hope they're able to learn at least something from that. Right? The slides are here. Okay, so I've listed down a bunch of topics you saw here, right? So in today's class, I actually walk through all of these. I'll touch upon each of these. This is a slightly non-conventional approach to teaching introduction to programming. But I'm taking this because otherwise we often see that in such courses, we end up teaching very contrived examples or very synthetic examples as a way of teaching programming, right? So we often ask students, can you sort a list of numbers? Why care about sorting a list of numbers? Why is that important, right? So we'll rather start with an application. Let's say that we have a spreadsheet, right? So I like spreadsheets a lot. So we'll start with a spreadsheet. I have already created some entries in this. Roll number, name, marks, and grade, right? So in fact, let me first delete this, or let me just hide this from the view. Right, so let's assume that you, at this point of time, have access to only the roll number, name, and marks, right? So you want to be able to write a program in order to do some manipulation around such data, right? We have not yet studied what is programming. We have not seen some real programs, but this is just showing what is the objective, what is the problem that we're trying to solve. right? So first we need to understand that what are the different kinds of data types that you may have in a spreadsheet, right? So what do you think about marks? Will marks be a decimal? So float is again a term used in programming. So will marks be a decimal, a number which with some number of decimal points? Does that make sense? Can marks be negative? Until unless there are some exams which have negative marking, we'd expect marks to be between 0 and 100, right? And we expect to have some decimal points, right? So by the way, again, as you might notice, there is no set of slides that I'm using. There is no prescribed textbook. So it makes sense to be very attentive in the class, right? So we may end up writing some programs, but we may not have everything released. Okay, so marks, we believe, are going to be something like a decimal point. Let's say that we have a single decimal point. So in programming world, we call such data types as floating point numbers, right? What about the name? So names will be bunch of characters from the English alphabet, right? They put together in some common, in some particular form, right? Generally, we expect some kind of convention when we are talking about names, like they capitalized, and they can be of variable length. Right? We can have names we saw yesterday. They could be names which were 10 characters. They were names which are about 30 characters, right? So we've seen that if we want to create such a spreadsheet application, we first need to understand that what are the different kinds of columns I have here, and what are the types of data that they can store. So we said that marks should be decimal points, or I'll just call them floating points. Names are a bunch of characters from the English language, from the English character set. And I'll call that a bunch of characters as something known as a string, right? So decimal or float and a bunch of characters or a string. What about the roll number as I'm showing here? We'd expect the roll number to be an integer. Right? So typically the roll number again has some meaning to it. Like your roll numbers might not be 1 to 5. They may be 2022 something, right? But we'll more or less say that they are integers. Any specific range on the integers? Can we have negative integers? So we can have negative integers, but the roll number will be strictly positive, right? We'd expect in this case to be 1 to 5, right? So thus far we have seen that there are 3 different kinds of data types which you would need in order to store this data, right? Eventually, we discussed yesterday that Microsoft Excel and such programs, in this case, I'm using the Apple Numbers software. These are also programs, right? So these programs somehow need to understand that what are the data types I need to store, and then you'll actually store the data. What about the grade? The grade will be a single character going from A to F, in our case, A to F. In fact, in our case, it's A plus to F, right? It's not A to F. A plus is an 11 on 10, right? Or you could have just stored a numerical representation for the grade, which would have been integer from, let's say, 4 to 10. 4 means fail, and 10 means A, and then 11 means A plus, right? So you're again, at this point of time itself, seeing that there could be various ways in which you can store the data. So this would often be defined by the user for you. In this case, we have the user say that we want letter grades, and we want them to be on a scale of A to F, something like that, right? So that's a very simple spreadsheet for you. Now, how do we translate this into something in Python, right? Again, you don't know Python, but don't worry. In this lecture, we're going to see the whole spectrum of things which we can do and create such a spreadsheet and then do some manipulation. Then basically, today's aim is to see that why we need all of these different concepts. If you don't understand these concepts, don't worry. In the future lectures, we will dive deep into each of these, right? But today I just want to go over all of them in one go. Okay, so we have thus far seen name, marks, grade, right? So without going into much details, let's fire up a programming environment. I will just go to Replit. Some of you have still not signed on Replit. Please do as soon as possible. Okay. So I open this window in Replit. I click on create. I search for a Python environment. So I go on create, I search for Python, and let's say I want to give some name. 25 November 2022. I create something known as a REPL. So the name of the website is Replit. Has anyone figured out what you mean by REPL? Okay, very good. But what do you understand by that? Okay. Okay, excellent. Again, I'm not going to go into details for this at this point of time, but that's a good answer. So you're presented with an interface now, right? So what do you see? On the left-hand side, you're seeing a folder-like structure, a directory-like structure, similar to what you'd seen on Windows, Linux, or Mac or OS X, right? On this page, you are seeing an editor, right? So all of you would have seen a notepad or Microsoft Word or things like that, where you type in some amount of text. So this is an editor. On the right-hand side, you see a console and a shell, right? So here we'll be typing some commands in the shell and in the console in order to run this program, which I'm typing in the editor, right? So we have files which are there in the editor, which are mentioned in this tree-like structure. We have the editor itself in between, and we have two command line interfaces to execute these programs, right? So maybe let's write a program. So we had this record. So now let's think of how we should go about creating this spreadsheet-like program, right? So we yesterday discussed it in computational thinking. We have this concept of decomposition, right? So can you think of this entire table as a matrix, right? Or you can think of it as you have one row, you have second row, you have third row, fourth row, fifth row, right? Each row is a record, right? Or it contains the data about a single student, right? So can you think of this table as multiple rows containing information about a student? Yes. So now if you have to create this spreadsheet-like program, can we break it down into simpler problems first? Can we think about a single student at first? Yes. So that's the conceptual thinking I want you to get into. Rather than getting overwhelmed by how to create this table, let's first focus on a single student, which corresponds to a single row. Once we can figure out how to create a single row, we can create multiple such rows. Now, this is not very different from the IKEA drawer experiment, which I was asking you yesterday. If you're trying to assemble an IKEA drawer, once you figure out the bottom panel, the other panels are going to be easier to assemble. Any questions, Sanla? Okay. So then we need to figure out about a single student first, right? But that is still a complex problem at this point. A single student's record entry is composed of how many fields? How many fields? 4. Roll number, name, marks, and grade. For now, let's assume that the grade will be decided based on the marks, right? We don't enter that grade. There is a formula which we use to calculate the marks. So in fact, I'm doing that in the spreadsheet. So I have this formula. If marks greater than 90, then give a grade A, otherwise give the grade B. Right? A very simple formula. This is how you may end up scoring. I am not using this formula for your class, by the way, but this is the formula. This is the kind of formulas that you can put in spreadsheet-like software and get the grade automatically. So in fact, let me do that for you rather than. So let's just delete this column first. Now we again create a column called grade. I say that this is if marks for this particular student are greater than 90, then give the grade A, otherwise give the grade B. That's it. And then I'll just use the formula on the remaining set of students. So only a single person gets an A, the other set of students get a B, right? So what I'm saying is that let's not bother about the grade. Let's only talk about 3 attributes: roll number, name, and marks, right? So for representing a single student at this point of time, we'll be using 3 attributes, right? Roll, name, marks, right? But now let's break that down into each individual attribute. Let's figure out the roll number, name, and marks, and let's see if we can enter that in a Python shell, right? In a Python editor. So let's say that I write roll equal to 1, right? I write name equal to Rahul, and I write marks equal to 80.5. Right? Now, roll number and marks, I've written as if they are. Right? I have not put any such symbol around them. Right? But for name, I've put these brackets around the name. Right? Why do you think that is needed? Okay. So firstly, whenever we write programs, right? So this is a very trivial program that we have already written in Python, right? So does this mean that roll is equal to 1? No. So this is something which we need to understand, which is the difference between mathematics and programming. Roll equal to 1 means that roll is assigned the value 1. Name is assigned the value Rahul, and marks is assigned the value 80.5, right? So what happens when we run such a program? Okay, so we wrote that roll is equal to 1, name is equal to Rahul, and marks is equal to, does anyone remember the mark? 80.5, right? So when you'll give this program to the computer to execute, I'm being a little hand wavy at this point of time. So what it does is it creates, so think of roll as a name that you've defined where you keep storing the value 1, right? So think of it as you're creating such boxes. You put an entry 1 in a box which you call roll. You put the entry Rahul in a box whose name is name, and we have an entry called 80.5 in a box whose name is marks, right? So can anyone give an example of how you would relate the concept of naming something to the boxes notation or convention I'm talking about? No, you're talking about computer science. I want something simpler. What you use in a real life? Sorry? Container. What is a container? So again, you're giving a very computer science answer. I want a more real world example. Yes, that's it. So this is not very different from, let's say you go to a kitchen or a grocery store, right? So you have, so how many of you have done any cooking? Any amount of cooking? Okay, good. Has anyone ever put sugar in place of salt or salt in place of sugar? Yes. And have you then felt that if the box was labeled, right, then you could have done a better job, because both of them look similar to you, especially when you start cooking, right? And then you end up with creating something which is horrible to eat, right? So the problem there is that you have certain values stored. Let's say this is a box, right? You are calling this, you put a label on that box, you call it sugar, and you have another box, you put some salt in it, and then you can put some dal in some other box, right? So now you have certain values and you have assigned a name to these boxes, right? This box is, the first box is called sugar, the second box is called salt, the third box is called dal. Now contrast this with, we want to store the information for a student, right? So we have 3 boxes. We store the value 1 in the box whose name is roll. We store the value Rahul in the box whose name we call name. And 80.5 is stored in a box whose name we call marks, right? So what is the use of, so in this example, what is the use of giving a name to a box? Convenience when you want to retrieve the contents, right? Let's say you want to cook something and the ingredients or the recipe says that add 5 tablespoons of salt. Now, all you need to do is to look at the label of the 2 boxes you have, sugar and salt, pick up the right one, pick up the one which says salt, put your tablespoon in it and pick up 5 tablespoons and put it in your dish, right? So if you give names to things you're storing, it helps you when you want to retrieve them and use them further in your process. In cooking, you further using them in the process to cook something, to bake something. Similarly, in a computer program, we'll be using these names in order to do further processing, right? So we're calling these things, the role, the name, and marks, as variables, right? As variable, V-A-R-I-B-L-E. So what do you understand by the literal word variable? What do you understand by the constant? So can you tell me any constant you've studied in physics? Planck's constant, some other constant? Speed of light, you've studied various constants, right? They do not vary, right? Yes. Although sometimes science improves and the value of constants also keeps changing, right? But that story apart. So variable, something which can vary. Something variable, something which can vary, which can change. Jisko badla ja sakta hai, right? So we assign the variables, role 1, name Rahul, marks 1. And I want you to be repeating this in your head multiple times. Role equal to 1, when you write it in Python, this means that assign value 1 in a variable called role. So the keyword assign is important. Similarly, name equal to Rahul. Assign the name, the string of characters or the English name Rahul to a variable or a box which is called name, right? Similarly, assign the value 80.5 to a variable called marks, right? Since these things are variables, we can also change them at a later point of time, right? We won't do that right away, but we can do that at any given point of time. Yes. Sorry. You'll have to be louder, or the TAs will have to get, are the TAs there? Okay. So the question is, can we write 2 equal to 1? What do you think? Yes. So what does 2 equal to 1 even mean? So you are trying to assign the value 1 to 2, but 1 is a constant, 2 is a constant. So how can you assign something to a constant? No, so there are certain things you can have as variables, certain things you cannot have as variables. So you can't have any name as a variable. And so I also want you to be very careful about one particular thing. So there will be some corner cases. So I would rather you do not think about such corner cases which are poor programming practices. So why on earth would you want to write 2 equal to 1? So it's not a bad question. It's a very curious question. But I would rather you not think about such questions, at least for the duration of this course, because that will just eat up the time which you can spend in other things. Right? So 2 equal to 1 is again going to confuse you. Don't bother about that. You should never be thinking about like using such things in your program. Right? Is the question clear? So of course, there are certain rules of what can be a variable, what you can write and what you cannot write as a variable. We're not discussing that today. As I mentioned, today's class, I just want to go over how to create a spreadsheet, touch upon all the topics which are required in this create a spreadsheet in this course. Other questions? I hope you're taking the positive steps. So it's not to discourage you. It's just to say that such questions can end up confusing you more. So stick to the basics, and then we can eventually look at the exceptions. Corner cases also. Okay, good. So we have written this program. Okay. Now I see the console, I see the shell, right? So I'm going to be executing this program, right? To execute a program, I need to know the name of the program. What is the name of this particular program? Or name of this file, main.py. So in Python, we use the extension .py to mean that these are Python files, right? So the name of this function, the name of this particular program is main.py, right? In order to execute a program, we need to first write Python, followed by the path and the name of the file, right? So path means to the directory structure where you are. So for now, we are in the correct directory. So I ran a particular command called ls, which lists the content of a directory. So those of you who used what is that called? MS-DOS. Anyone use their MS-DOS? Okay, or it was probably retired before you started your learning. So similarly, we have command prompt in Windows, right, and in Linux and in OS X also. So this just lists the directory content, right? This is not very different from if you go to this side, right? You see that there is a file called main.py in this folder, right? And let me just execute this program, Python main.py. And what happened? I don't see any changes. So I ran this program. It did not give me any errors. If it would have given any errors, that would have been flagged, right? And it worked out okay, right? But there is nothing displayed, right? Or we did not ask the user for any amount of input, right? So if you remember one of the examples that we gave yesterday, that was, I can actually run that. Okay, what does this program do? If you remember yesterday, we showed this program. Ask the user to give a temperature in Celsius. Let's just assume it's Celsius to Fahrenheit. Ask the user to give the temperature in Celsius. Once the user enters the temperature in Celsius, it then shows the user the temperature in Fahrenheit, right? So can you see that there are three main things happening here? You ask the user for an input, what should be the temperature? It does some processing, which is just do some calculations to figure out that the relationship between Fahrenheit and Celsius, and then it shows the answer. Took the input from the user, I have entered 30. I clicked on convert, there was a bunch of formulas which ran, and then you get the answer as 86.0 Fahrenheit, right? So we've seen that there are three main components which we'll see for any program, right? So let me just get back to drawing and then share. So we will have an input. We will process that and give some output, right? So for the example which we just saw a second before, the input was temperature in degrees Celsius. Process is a formula which converts Celsius to Fahrenheit. So 9 by 5 C minus 32, something like that. I don't know. Is this the correct formula? And the output is show temperature in degree Fahrenheit, right? Any questions thus far? So we also saw this, I think it's good to revise. We saw that with all the computing applications, we'll generally see an input, some processing, some output, right? So we saw that with a credit card swipe, the input that you give is you actually swipe the credit card through the credit card machine. There is a process which connects to the server, which connects to the bank, does the transaction. The output that you get, that is that money is deducted from your account, credited through the account of the company in which you're paying, plus you get a payment receipt. Right? So across various kinds of programs that you'll see input, processing, output. Right? Okay, so let's come back now. So we have already written a first program, right? So congratulations on that. We would have, so that this also shows that getting started in programming is not very hard, even if you've not done any amount of programming earlier. You just open up Replit, you write a very simple program. But at this point of time, the program does not do much, right? So think about what a spreadsheet does. You enter certain characteristics, roll number, name, marks, right? But can you also see these characteristics on the screen? Yes, you've entered something, but you also see something on the screen. How do you think Excel does this? How does Excel show you these numbers? Yes, any thoughts? Yeah, so it's organized in a tabulated form, but come back to the question which I was mentioning, or the concept I was talking about. Each program will have an input or set of inputs, do some processing, show some output, right? When I was typing in my keyboard, that was the input I was giving. Put roll number equal to 1, name equal to Rahul, marks equal to 80.5. The output that I'm getting from this program is that these quantities are displayed on the screen in a tabular format, right? So input, processing, output. Right? So we'll look at a very kiddish example of giving the same thing, of printing out the same thing, or showing the same thing to the user in a different way in a Python program. We do that by something known as print. So let's say I print right. So I made some modification to this program. Again, don't worry about the syntax for now. What do you think print does is exactly what it does. It prints out the contents to the terminal, right? So let's now run the program again. We ran the program main.py. Everything is the same as before, but now we have an additional line of code called print roll, roll, right? So this roll, as we discussed, anything enclosed in double quotes is a string, right? Is a sequence of characters. This roll we saw is a variable, right? What is the value stored in roll at this point of time? 1, right? But what is the type of roll? Okay, that's a tricky question at this point of time because of the way Python is slightly different from the other programming languages. Let's not get too much into types for now, but let's think it's an integer, right? So yes, we can use single quotes. So there are things I won't tell on purpose because I think again for people who are starting out new, things will confuse. That's why I stick to the bare minimum things. So just think about double quotes only. Anything which you enclose in double quotes is a string. So we have written a first program which gives some output to the user, right? It has not taken any input from the user at this point of time, but it is giving some output to the user, right? Which is the roll number. But can I also print out the name and marks? Yes. I just need to copy this line of code, change this to name. Actually, this is the typing mistake that I've done, right? Now let's try and run this program. You get an error, right? So whenever you see this word trace back, it means that an error has occurred and it is trying to trace you back to the place where the error occurred, right? So it says that name error, name A and MB is not defined, right? So can anyone help me with understanding what is this error? Right. So So whenever we're talking about variables, we need to assign some value to the variable. How do we assign a value to a variable? If a variable name is x, x equal to something means assign that value to x, right? We are using this variable name a and me, but have we ever assigned a value to a and me? Nothing, right? So therefore, it's not a defined variable, right? So such kinds of errors will be very common in programming. Thankfully, we have some tracebacks. So we can now correct this to the correct name of the variable. We run it again. We see that role equal to 1, name equal to Rahul is getting printed, right? So in just 15 minutes or so, we have now been able to create something, a toyish version of the spreadsheet application which you're seeing. Right? We can, of course, just print out the marks also. So name, roll number, name, and marks are getting printed. Right? They're being displayed to the user in the form of output on the shell. Any questions? Yes. I can't hear you. Do we have some mic? It's not showing you the shell. So if you've typed all of this, you can click on the plus here and you can add shell. If you don't see a shell, you okay. So I'm assuming that it's a programming error which we can sort out either after the class or in the lab session. So in the lab sessions, that this is going to be the purpose. You'll get much more personalized attention because you'll be split up into smaller groups where you can ask such questions. Okay, so what all do we now need to create the spreadsheet application? Let's go back to the spreadsheet. I want you to think and tell me some answers. What is there which is present in the spreadsheet which is not currently present in your program? Sorry, the grade. Okay, so we need to figure out a grade, but let's now quickly go back to the course website. So we mentioned that variables are there in the course website, right? In the course syllabus, we've seen what variables are. We have not dived very deep into what various things we can do with variables, but for now we've seen variables. And in the spreadsheet, we saw that this grade that we are defining is based on a simple condition. If marks greater than 90, then grade equal to B. Otherwise, if marks greater than 90, then grade equal to A. Otherwise, the grade is B, right? So we want to be able to do the same thing in a Python program. So this is done by something known as a conditional. Again, the literal English meaning should be sufficient here to understand. Let's go back to the code. So all I'll say is that if marks greater than 90.0, then grade is equal to A, else grade equal to B, right? So this is some particular syntax which the programming language Python follows. We'll be able to pick up the syntax in the coming weeks. But even those who have not done any programming earlier, can you literally just understand what is happening? If marks greater than 90, then the grade has to be A. Otherwise, or else, the grade is B, right? Don't worry about what is this colon that I've put, why I've put a few spaces around that. That is a part of the syntax, right? So English has a particular syntax, right? Can you tell me something which is particular about English, which you always need to follow? Full stop at the end of the sentence. That's one particular thing you have add in English. What else? Starts with capital letters mostly until unless you have certain exceptions to it. Yes. Like if you have, sorry. I alone, when I alone is used, it's always used in capital character. What else? How do you proceed, or how do you use some characters with vowels? Vowels A, I, O, U. Right? We use, instead of A, use an at different places. What about possession? If something belongs to someone, how do you use? So this particular phone belongs to Rahul, right? How can I say this is Rahul's phone, right? And what if the name of the person ends with an S? Let's say Shreyas. This is Shreyas's phone, or this is Shreyas, right? So you might find the language very weird, right? But you have started to live with it, right? You've made peace with the fact that the way English is what it is, right? So therefore, you've said that English language has a particular set of syntax. Similarly, in Hindi, right? How do we end sentences in Hindi? Purn viram, right? Purn viram, pura viram diya, khatam kiya humne. Vakya ko khatam kiya, right? So similarly, in different languages, you have different kind of syntaxes. You have, similarly, in a programming language, we also have certain syntaxes, right? So what you're seeing here is a part of that syntax. Whenever you're checking for some conditions, like when you write this word if, right? Then it's a reserved word, right? There are certain reserved words in English also. Like, can you tell me a reserved word in English? The or a. You can't be using that to define your name, right? You can't have a name the, the. You can't have a name a, right? Similarly, there are some reserved words in the Python programming language. If is one of them, else is another one of them. And this is a part of the syntax that whenever you're checking for some condition, you have if some condition. If, I'm just highlighting what I'm saying. If some condition is true, then assign grade. Else, if the condition is true, assign something else to the grade, right? Again, don't worry about the exact form of the syntax. We will go into this in the coming weeks. This is just to be able to create the entire spreadsheet program, right? So now we can also print out the grade. Grade and grade. We run the program again. Roll number is 1, name is Rahul, marks is 80.5, grade is B, right? So are we on course to creating the spreadsheet application now, or what is missing? Sorry, other entries are there, but even before that. So we have printed something to the output, right? But did we ask the user to tell you the roll number, name, marks? Yes or no? No, right? We didn't ask the user. We had them hard coded. So when we write, assign the variables in this way, and we call this, we're hard coding the variables. So we just fix the values of these variables. We've never asked the user for it, right? We'll modify this program so that we can ask the user to tell their roll number, tell their name, tell their marks. We'll get those values, and then we'll proceed the same. Okay? So let's then modify that program. So I'll say that first I'll just print. Of course, there are better ways to do this, but I'm showing the way which is more beginner friendly. Print, enter your roll number, right? And then, so printing means printing something to the console. Consequently, when we want to take some input from the user, we'll end up using a keyword called input. We'll end up using a function called take input from the user, which is called input, right? Print something, whatever you put inside of print to the console, to the terminal, and input does the opposite. Whatever you enter on the terminal is captured, and that is stored in whatever you want to store, some variable you want to store. So I'll store this roll equal to input. So it gets the first input. So let me in fact just comment out the remaining code, right? So you'll hear this term very often used in the context of programming, commenting out, right? It's a common practice. I want to see only this amount of the program to run at this point of time. So I'm saying that all of the other stuff is just garbage for now. That will not get executed. Let's just clear the terminal. Now let's run the program again. Python main.py. It has printed out something, enter your role, right? Because that was a part of the print statement that we had given. Now it's waiting for you to enter something, right? Let me just enter my role 1, right? So the program executed. At this point of time, it took the input from the user, stored that in a variable called role. right? But an important thing to notice here is that this variable, so whatever we get from the terminal or whatever the input that we get is by default type string. You get a string of characters. So you'll have to convert that into an integer, right? This may again be sounding a little foreign, don't worry. We'll pick it up eventually. So I will actually just show you the entire program first. Print, enter your name. Then print, enter marks, and marks equal to input. And we'll convert them into something known as a float, right? Or if you want to make things even more explicit, right? So we started with this. We have 3 different columns. Roll number we set is an integer, right? So is the program starting to make a little bit of sense? Again, not worrying too much about the specifics of the syntax. We said that the roll number is an integer, right? Int means an integer. The roll number is an integer. Name is a string. str is the keyword which you use in Python. Marks are decimal points, decimal numbers, or numbers with the decimal points, or in programming, we call them float, right? So 3 different kinds of data, and we have just stored them accordingly, right? So we have now got role, name, marks, and then we can figure out the grade as we had previously done. And let me just remove that. Now let me run the program again. Enter your roll number 2, enter name, let's say the second roll number was Sia, and her marks were 92.1. So then you get printed all of these things. Roll number is 2, name is Sia, marks is 92.1, and grade is A. So fortunately, the code is working because now we've seen that the grade is A and not B, right? For the previous roll number, the grade was a B. Right? Any questions thus far? Yes.
Sir, am I audible? Sir, initially when we asked the user to only enter their roll number.
Okay, let's go one at a time. So I have gone to ask the user to enter a roll number, this line.
Initially when we started asking for input, the first time when we did it.
Okay.
Yeah, we did it like this. So
Yes.
is it like when we have multiple types of entries, we have both strings and integer type entries, then we need to mention it like str and int in front of it?
So whenever we get any input from the user, that is always a string of characters that you get. You will have to, based on the data type that you have to assign, you'll have to convert that. So every time you get input from the console using the input, that will be a string. You'll have to change that to an integer or a string, which is default, or float or other things, depending on the application that you have in mind. Right? Does that sound good to everyone? So every time you get input from the user, the type of that data, of the type of the input you're getting is a string. Yes. Sorry. Can we have the mic there? There, that side. The difference between console and shell? Okay. So shell, think of this as your regular terminal. Right? This is the terminal which you have. So shell is something like this. Right? This is a command line interface to my operating system. Right? Shell is the command line interface to your operating system. You can run various things, like I can run the ls command, which lists the directories. I can figure out where I am in my directory structure using the pwd command. I can do various kinds of things, right? Correspondingly, using the console, That is an interactive version of Python, which you use for generally for small snippets of code you want to write. So if I didn't give any name of a file following Python, right? I then drop into something which is known as the Python console, right? So here I can run small tidbits of Python program without having to write a full file of full code in the editor, right? So I can do some small things here also. Print hello, will print out hello. I can say a equal to 10. Print a, it prints out a, right? But so whenever you have some small tidbit of code which you want to quickly run, you end up, so often people then use this this console or the Python console. But when you have to run the full Python file, all the lines running one after the other, you end up running the shell, the file on the shell, Python file.py. Yes, other questions? Yes. So the string is already a string. I didn't have to write it. I just wanted to show that because at the start of the lecture, we said that there are 3 data types: integer, string, and float. This was just to make it very explicit. It is not required. So Python is a language where it's always better to be explicit, right? That's one of the keywords. So,
Sir.
Okay, sorry. Does anyone know how do we invoke the Zen? Okay, let me Python Zen. How do we invoke the Zen? Import this. Right. So if you write this, import this in any Python interpreter, you'll end up with a certain principles which are recommended for usage in Python. So explicit is better than implicit. Means that you just make it very explicit that the data type for these objects are string, float, and integer.
Sir, after enter your roll number, sir.
Okay, just one second. Let me go back to the code. Yes.
Sir, we had the input on the next line.
Too. Yes.
So can we get that on the same line?
Can we?
Can we get the input 2 on the same line, enter your roll?
So no. So I mean, you can do some weird things. But for now, let's think that each line, you'll just do one operation. Just to keep things simple. You can just, so first, let me just expand this so that it looks. So print is one line of code. Roll equal to input is another line of code. And think of the program or the operating system will be able to run each line of code one after the other. Yes. Okay. So you might see that there is a run button here, right? So I don't recommend using this run button because that will work with only the file which is named main.py in that correct directory. So if you call this run, it will run this particular program. So run, if you press on run, it actually always runs it. So run means that you've typed Python main.py on the shell, right? But the name of your file could be something else. It could be main2.py, it could be hello.py, right? That is where if you have another file, it will not be able to run, right? So let me actually show you that. Let me rename this to hello.py, right? And now let me run this. You see that the process died because it was expecting the file main.py, which does not exist. So it's always recommended. Now what do I need to do in this console, in this shell? Python. So another thing you might notice, I just type pyth and then I press tab. So it does tab completion. So it's something you'll pick up as you become programmer, become more experienced. HE, do a tab. I press a tab. It just does a tab completion, shows the only file which exists. Enter a role 1, name, here, marks 20, and this person still gets a grade B because we've just put a single condition. Okay. Other questions? Yes. Why was it? So this is the code. This is the way Replit is created. That the run button is configured to figure out if there's a file called main.py, and it basically runs Python main.py in the shell. But I recommend that we not get stuck only with main.py and using UI, because it's not a very good practice in the long run. I want you to be able to run the programs using the command line interface. Yes, other questions? Okay, good. So thus far we have seen that if we go to the spreadsheet, we know how to take input from the user. In the spreadsheet, I just type it out, right? Because I have visual cues. I have the role, name, marks as a column headers already. So it's easy for me to just type out, but those get printed out. Yes. What if you want to add? Yes. Okay. So what if we want to have more grades? So how would you, can you just explain me your logic for grades? I don't want a computer science logic. So what is the procedure you want to give for grades? So currently we have if marks greater than 90, then A, otherwise B. So what is the criteria for, let's say you want to give a C. Yes. So what he's saying is that the question is that currently we have the criteria greater than 90A, but everything else is B, right? Maybe what we want to say is that
we can close the if command. Yes, elif.
so if marks greater than 80, A. If marks are not greater than 90, give an A. Otherwise, are the marks greater than 80, give B. Otherwise, give a C. Right? So it's a very natural translation to how you would write in English, or how you would think about it. Right? Again, don't get worried about the syntax for now. No need to take snapshots. You'll be sent this. Other questions? Yes. So the question is, why do we have to explicitly make the input as float? Because by default, whatever you get from the input is a string. That is the convention. That is how it will be. Whether you write 80.5, that will actually always be a string with written 80.5. Right? You have to convert that to a float. That's how the program is being built. That's how the language is being built. By default, everything that you get from the console, from the user input, is a string. You need to explicitly convert it into the data type that you want. If the input is so the question is that roll number we had to explicitly convert to a floating point number, whereas for name it's already a string. We don't need to do anything. Yes, we could have just written this as this, and it would have been fine. But I was just saying that it's for the first lecture, maybe it's better to just make it explicit that we have 3 data types, 3 fields: string, float, and an integer. Okay, good. Other questions? Yes. Okay, let's not bother about LF. So we'll come to LF at a later point of time. I just wanted to show that because there was a question, we can give grades based on multiple conditions, but we don't need to worry about LF for now. Let's go back to the spreadsheet. And so now I want everyone's attention back. So I think some of the people who already knew programming were finding this a little easy, but now we're looking into something which you may not have done earlier, right? So now we have created a single row in some sense, right? Roll number, name, marks, and grade, right? We want to be able to bind all of these values together, right? In the spreadsheet context, we call that a record, a row, right? A row has roll number, name, marks, and grade, right? How do we do that in the context of Python? So we have looked at certain data types, which are simple data types, int, and then float, and then string, right? But we want maybe a compound data type, which is something more complex, where we can store a roll number, name and marks and grade corresponding to each user, right? So if we go back to the course curriculum, we have things like dictionaries, tuples, and object-oriented programming, right? Again, without bothering you about all the details, just think of it as we want to be able to store all of these values together, right? We want a single row which contains the name, the roll number, and the marks and the grade, right? Now, I will be using something known as class, right? This may be the last topic that we'll study in the course, right? So again, don't worry too much if you don't understand all of this, right? I create an object, I create something known as a record where I want to be able to store roll number, marks, name, and grade in one go, right? So this is, I'm trying to create a row of the spreadsheet, right? So without worrying about the syntax, I have just created 3 records here, which corresponding to first, which is the roll number, second, the name, third, the marks, right? And I've done some bit of jugglery in order to print out these things beautifully, in a prettier way. So my record 1, my row 1 has a roll number, has a name, has some marks, and has a grade, right? This is having one-to-one correspondence with what you see in the spreadsheet. My row number 1 has a roll number, name, marks, and grade, right? So I'm using a concept here called class to be able to couple all these values, to bind all of these values corresponding to a single student or a single roll number. But I could have used some other concept, such as a dictionary or a tuple, right? So which are dictionary, tuple, object oriented. So this is to show that you can have simple data types, which are your roll number, which is an integer, the name, which is a string, and the marks, which is a float. But then you want all of these to be bundled together for a single user, for a single record, right? That we can do using advanced data structures in Python, which are also known as collections. These can be things like lists, tuples, dictionaries, and classes, right? So without worrying too much, now think of it as that you have now got some way to store a row, right? You have some way to store a row which consists of 4 entries, right? So you see that I have R1, I have 4 entries corresponding to that record. The role, name, marks, and grade, 4 entries, right? Come back to the spreadsheet. Your spreadsheet, I said at the beginning, can be considered as a collection of rows, multiple rows, right? You have row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. All of them will be using the same structure, right? So once you figure out how to create a single row, can you say that you have a list of rows in a spreadsheet that creates a spreadsheet, right? So that's the beauty of programming, that once you've defined a simpler concept, you can build on it in order to create a more complex concept. In this case, a spreadsheet, we can think of a spreadsheet as a collection of rows, right? And we can use another data type, we go back to the computing course, which is called a list, right? Multiple, so where do we hear about the term list? How many of you use to-do lists? Yes, how many of you use to-do lists and then at the end of the day, just say, forget it, can't do? Yes. So surprisingly, lesser number of people use to-do lists than the number of people who say they use to-do lists, but they give up. So what does a to-do list contain? A list of things which you plan to do, right? A collection of things, a list of things which you plan to do, right? You have multiple such lists. You have task 1, task 2, task 3, task 4, right? List of things. Similarly, a spreadsheet is a list of rows, right? You have row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, right? So that is the connection you can see between something like simple as to-do list and a spreadsheet, which we're creating. So I'm again not going to show you much of the code. It's not going to be making sense because you have not studied these concepts. I am creating a spreadsheet where I can add multiple records. I have a spreadsheet. I have one record, one row. I can add multiple such records, right? So I end up creating something similar in Python code. I create a spreadsheet. I record, I add record R1, record R2, record R3. And then if I want to print my spreadsheet, it looks something like the following, right? So this is to show you that in about an hour and a half, you can create a small spreadsheet like application, right? But don't get too excited. It would probably take thousands of engineers to create something like a Microsoft Excel. So going from here till there, while we're on the right track, it's a very long road to go. Any questions thus far? Yes, any questions? Yes, just 1 second. Okay.
How the lines are created, the slanting lines and
Okay, good.
lines.
So people who have done programming, how have we created these lines? These are dashes, but I am using something known as repr, REPR. Right? So by the way, I'm just curious because I have not seen the class 11, 12 syllabus for Python. Do you use the repr function, REPR function? No? So something for even the folks who have done programming to learn. You can use this repr function. And if you had time and energy, or if you were just getting bored, you can write just a couple of lines of code and actually create an HTML table out of it, right? So you'll have to use a function called repr HTML, REPR HTML. Then you can create an HTML table out of it. So these are some fun things I would suggest even people who have done programming earlier to keep on trying. Other question, there was one question. So we have basically printed out. So we can print out empty lines. We can print out these ... like things, right? So let me show you that. Yes, just wait. So again, I'm doing this the mundane way. I have not done this way in the program. So I've created ... line, hyphen. And if I run this program now, it asks me for the roll number 1, name, marks 34. So fortunately, our logic is working. The grade is now C instead of B, but you also see now the lines. You can print out any string. This hyphen is also a string of character. Yes, question. There was some question here. Other questions? Okay. So we have thus far seen that we can, I'll again go back. So I'll be again repeating things. In order to create a spreadsheet, we first break it down, the spreadsheet, into a number of rows, right? A spreadsheet is a collection of a list of rows. Each row consists of a record for a student in this case, which consists of various fields: roll number, name, marks. Roll number is an integer, name is a string, marks is a float. We can calculate the grade using certain conditions on the marks, right? In order to bind up roll number, name, marks, grade together, we need to use a container, or we need to use a collection object. So in this case, we are using something known as a class. We could have also used a dictionary or a tuple or even a list. And then once we've created this record, we need to create multiple such records, which we can have like we do for a to-do list. We can have a list of such records, which creates a spreadsheet, right? So thus far, good. Let's come back to the concepts or the spreadsheet. Okay. So we have covered variables, conditionals, list, dictionary, tuples, object oriented, right? We're still left with loops, functions, and strings, right? So let's think of this question now. I want you to figure out that who has the highest marks in the spreadsheet. This is a very small spreadsheet. It will take you a matter of seconds to figure that out, right? But if you were to write a program, how would you do that? I showed this yesterday also. So firstly, when we want to figure out who has the highest marks, do I need to first worry about the roll number, name, and grade? No, I need to only look at the marks column, right? Now, this is where many conventional programming courses start, or they motivate problems. They tell you that given a list of numbers, find out the highest in that list, right? But that seems very contrived. That seems very synthetic problem. But now here you see it's a real world problem that you're working with. You're given a bunch of marks. So the question was not what is the highest marks, but who has the highest marks, right? But in order to solve that, I need to first figure out what is the highest marks, right? So I'll show you how first we do this in something like Excel. So the highest marks, obviously, because it's a very small spreadsheet, we can just eyeball the data and we can tell you the answer. But the highest score is a function which is max of C2 to C5, right? So it is a function. In the spreadsheet term, it's called a function, which looks at the values C column, and row number 2, 3, 4, 5, should have been a 6 also. It figures out the max of this column, which is 92.1, right? So we wrote this thing called equal to max, and we pass in a bunch of values, right? And this particular thing is known as a function, right? So we've studied functions in mathematics, right? Can someone tell me what do you understand by function in mathematics? It is a relation between some input and output, right? So you give some input, you give some output, give some input, give some output. So similarly, in this case, I've given a bunch of numbers, right? Which are 80.5, 92.1, 83.2, 87.1, 88.4. Bunch of numbers. This function accepts a bunch of numbers as input, gives the highest of them as an output, right? So function is a mapping between certain inputs and an output, right? So the reason why functions exist is because we don't want to be writing the same code again and again. So I can write a program to find out the max of a bunch of numbers. You can do that, but it doesn't make sense. Maybe it's better if Excel provides that functionality because it's a very common functionality, right? So we have a function now which accepts as input a bunch of numbers and gives us output the highest number amongst them, right? So this is where we'll touch up on things like functions, right? Let's come back to the spreadsheet. So we look at this. If you look at the names, can you spot out anything which is looking a little odd? The name Amrit seems is in small characters, right? So we need to maybe capitalize it or title case, right? So if we go back to the program, right? So we had this was how my, so maybe I need to, while I'm putting up the name, I can maybe just put, so what is that function called? Name or capitalize, right? So I've now created a small change to my program that whenever it looks at a name being passed from the user, it will capitalize it just to make things better. So we first see, this is how my program looked earlier. Amrit was indeed in a smaller case. Let me run my code again. And now the name Amrit happens to be in capital case, right? So what have we done? We have taken a string of characters or a collection of characters, and we have done some modification to that, right? So there are going to be certain string functions which you will be using to make your life easier in the program, right? So we saw one string function yesterday. Can someone think what we did yesterday? So we looked at all the names yesterday. What did we do yesterday in terms of, did we do some manipulation to the names yesterday? Yes, little louder. You're correct. Who answered that? We had a full name given yesterday, right? We split that into first name and last name, right? So similarly, we can do that kind of an operation here also, right? So that is also a string operation. We can modify that, right? So therefore, we can have various kinds of things which we can do to manipulate strings, which will then cover up what we do in strings. Right? We've seen some simple manipulation of strings. One was capitalization of a string. One is you break down a string into first name and last name. So maybe let me just show you, give you a demo on that also. So let's say if you had some full name equal to first and last, right? So I can do full name dot split on space. Recognize this lady?